from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. Hear now God's word. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea, beyond the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees came to him, and to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been made so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I invite you to join me in our prayer of preparation. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our redeemer. Amen. Today is our second stop on our journey through the hard sayings of Jesus. Last week we looked at what's called the eternal sin, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, and that it's very likely Jesus was pointing out the hard-heartedness of the religious folks. We need to have soft hearts, open to God's will in our lives. Today, we are looking at another difficult saying of Jesus, this time on the topic of marriage and singleness. Let me share with you a little joke on the topic that I really like. It goes like this. During the wedding rehearsal, the groom approached the minister with an unusual offer. "Look, I'll give you $100 if you'll change the wedding vows. When you get to me and the part where I'm to promise love, honor, and obey, and forsaking all others, be faithful to her forever, I'd appreciate it if you just leave that part out." He passed the minister the cash and walked away satisfied. The wedding day arrives, and the bride and groom are about to exchange vows. When it comes to the time for the groom's turn, the minister looks the young man in the eye and says, "Will you promise to prostrate yourself before her, obey her every command and wish, serve her breakfast in bed every morning of your life, and swear eternally before God and your lovely wife that you will not even look at another woman, as long as you both shall live?" The groom gulps and looks around and says in a tiny voice, "Yes." And he leans in towards the minister and whispers, "I thought we had a deal." And the minister puts the $100 into his hand and whispers back, "She made me a much better offer." Do you know any marriages like that? We just read in Matthew 19 where Jesus seems to be saying a couple of things that don't make much sense to us if we take them at face value. He seems to say directly that divorce is always wrong unless your spouse cheats on you. When you live in a country where about 50% of marriages end in divorce, you have to wonder if all these people are wrong in God's eyes, or is there something else going on? Second, Jesus makes a bizarre statement that might be a little harder to catch because he uses couched language to say it. Jesus, again, seems to essentially say it is better to mutilate part of your own body for God's kingdom than to get married. Has Jesus gone crazy? This is strong and even disturbing language he's using. We're going to dive in and try our best to figure out what he's saying here. But know that Jesus speaks directly to those that are married, those that have gone through divorce, and those that are single. So today's message matters to everyone here. Let's take a look then at a story of a couple that has found true love It begins with Jason and Amanda. You might recognize Jason Isbell. He sold an album this past year that went pretty big. He used to be in a band called Drive-By Truckers and now has several solo albums. But before he got big, he was pursuing this girl named Amanda. Amanda actually didn't want to date Jason. Jason was a bit of a bad boy, out carousing every night, and Amanda just was not interested. But finally, Jason hit a point where he was ready to be a different person. He was with Amanda and told her, "I want to go to rehab." See, Jason had a pretty serious problem with drinking and drugs. Looking back on that time, he says there were years of his life that are just fuzzy. He doesn't remember what happened because of the drugs. So he told Amanda that he wanted to go to rehab, and Amanda jumped at it. After a day or two of him trying it out on his own and failing, she called some of his friends, called his manager, and looked up rehab centers in the area. The problem was Jason knew it was coming. So he spent the night doing everything he could to destroy his body. The alcohol, the drugs, they added up to what Amanda calls the worst night ever. But she decides she's going to follow through on his request despite how angry she is with him for the last night, and gets him into a rehab center. While he's there, he wrote letters to Amanda because he isn't allowed to call anyone. So she's getting these letters and she's still mad at him for what he did. She's certain she doesn't even want to be with him. But Jason promises that he's changed, he's made so much progress. She would be so proud if she could just see it, and that he wants to be with Amanda. So when he finally gets out after all the letters, the drawings, and everything sweet he said, Jason goes back to Amanda. He's pursued her for so long before rehab and had focused so much of his time while there on getting back to her that when he's finally in front of her, it's nerve-wracking. He's not sure how she's going to respond or what she'll say, but lucky for him, she has decided to take him back. They ended up getting married a year after he got sober, and just last month, they had their first baby, a little girl. Now, that's the kind of story we like to hear, and the kind that many of us want for ourselves. Amanda helps to drag Jason out of the muck and make him a better person. She is the reason his last two albums have been as good as they are, because he's drug-free and living a better life. Unfortunately, that's not always how things work out. Sometimes the problems get out of hand and people head downhill fast. Sometimes couples break up and marriages end. What is an appropriate response? What do we do when things don't work out? Emily and I have been married now almost 6 years, and we found that by far the hardest part of our marriage has been babies, particularly babies that never go to sleep. I know many of you are tired of hearing about it from me, but I remember a couple of years ago when we were coming back from a trip out to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where Emily's family is from. And as we're driving back, it was just about the first time ever that Davy was peacefully sleeping in the car. And we had a few minutes where it was just Emily and me. She asked me, "How are things?" And I took just a couple of minutes to share a few difficult things that were happening here in the church. And I'll never forget this. Emily said, "This is the first time I'm realizing that things are hard for you at work and at home." I felt like shouting out praises to God. Oh, thank you, God. She finally understands. I work hard, but I can't always control the results, and it can be incredibly stressful here in the church. Then I go home and immediately encounter screaming babies and Emily needing the rest of the night off from caring for the kids. I know that stage was hard on both of us, and we are both grateful that we've turned a corner. The toddler and preschooler stage is easier for us than the baby stage by far. That's for sure. And so for us, that more difficult stage has finally ended. We can now rest and recover. We can heal from some of the wounds that were inflicted. I can only imagine, though, what it must be like for people who don't get that break, who deal with different kinds of pain and suffering day in and day out, who have a constant barrage of struggles. I just can't imagine what that must be like. And that seems to be one of the main reasons for divorce. Things get bad, and couples stop working to build each other up. They just spiral more and more downward. There's a professor, John Gottman, who is well known as a psychologist dealing with marriage. Over his career, he was able to gauge with 94% accuracy which couples would divorce and which would stay together. How did he do this? He did it through intense scrutiny of how couples interact. He could sit with a couple for 1 hour and their interaction would be scored. When the scores were more negative for extended periods of time, then it became obvious that divorce would follow. Sometimes it would take months, sometimes years or decades, but when these patterns were in place, it came 94% of the time. So what do we do with this? Many of us want great relationships with others around us, but it just doesn't always happen. It doesn't always work out. Here's an amazing point Gottman makes. He says that all couples disagree essentially the same amount. The question is not how much do you agree or disagree with someone. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And that same question goes for all of us in any relationship we have. Whether we are single, dating, or married, what do you do with the relationships you have, knowing that all of us disagree with others about the same amount of time? Jesus makes a statement about relationships, even if it isn't easy for us to hear. But first, I think we need a little background. In Jesus' time, there were two main Jewish groups that interpreted the Scriptures. Jesus has in mind these opinions in his statements. There was one group, the Shammai, which seems to be the position Jesus takes. They believed Moses' law meant don't divorce unless a spouse is unfaithful. When the covenant is broken, the marriage is over. But there was another group called the Hillel who had a very different opinion. The Hillel said a man could divorce his wife for just about any reason. They interpreted Moses' law to mean it is valid to divorce a woman if she burns your toast. Another reason given is if a man finds a woman who is more attractive than his current wife. These reasons are absolutely absurd. And Jesus here is making a choice for the group that encourages a life-giving decision here. And divorce can bring all kinds of consequences with it. And it was a difficult thing in that time to be divorced from a person. Today we might ask a question like, will you get to keep the house? Where will the children live? How will you make enough money to survive? But in Israel, those problems were magnified. Sometimes it was a matter of life and death when it came to divorce. So of course, Jesus would come down on the side of Shammai, seeking life for these women. But there's another point I think Jesus is making. When we read this statement from Jesus, we hear, when you divorce, the only legitimate reason for divorce is when someone cheats on you. But I don't think Jesus is saying that. The law in Jesus' time was very clear on this point. If someone was found to have cheated on a spouse, divorce was automatic. There was no option. I think Jesus is saying here, don't look down on someone because the law has forced a person into a divorce. If we apply that same line of thinking to today, I think we would wind up in a very different place from what we might suppose that Jesus is thinking and saying. I'll come back to this point in a moment, but let's move on ahead to the next issue and tie them together. After his words on marriage, Jesus says something about eunuchs. By birth, some are made eunuchs by other people, and some make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. Being a eunuch involved castration, which was not an acceptable thing in the Jewish culture. It's a gross image that Jesus is using here. So what is he saying? Most people have interpreted this as a metaphor. Jesus is saying, be so committed to God's way that you give up everything else in life. A godly life is more important than your job, more important than the things you possess. God's call on your life is even more important, and this is hard for many of us to hear, more important than your family. It is the single most important thing in life. My family means more to me than my job, even as a pastor of the church. They mean more to me than anything I own. But when you compare me and God to me and my family, that's like comparing the distance from the floor to the ceiling to the distance between the floor and the sky, or the floor and the stars. It's just not a fair comparison. God means everything to us because God is the reason we exist. God is the glue that holds this universe together. Without God, there would be no job or family. We simply would not be. The amazing thing is that when we truly put God first and live our lives according to the gospel ethic of love, it actually makes all of our other relationships better. It means how we treat things is better. It means better relationships with friends and family. It means a happier, healthier you. I think that's really the point, especially when it comes to marriage, divorce, and singleness. Wherever you find yourself, seek the best relationships you can. If you've made a covenant in marriage, do everything in your power to strengthen that marriage. Don't give up on it. Don't take that commitment lightly. If you find yourself divorced, whether it's a permanent status for you or a season, live it to its fullest. Find life in it. Pursue God with everything because it makes all the other stuff better. And if you are single, if you've chosen a life of devotion to God, again, whether it's a season or a lifetime, you have a special gift, a special opportunity of service to this world. You don't have the same concerns as others, and you can give something the rest of us can. And devoting that opportunity first to God and to others as an act of love to this world is huge. Let me end with this. In 1815, a journal in Germany published a letter that described Mozart's creative process. It said Mozart's greatest works came to him complete when he was alone and in a good mood. He needed no tools to compose them. Once he had finished imagining his masterpieces in his mind, all he had to do was write them down. Numerous authors have used this letter to explain the process of creativity, but there's a problem here. Mozart did not write this letter. It is actually a forgery. Mozart's real letters reveal the process, though. He was exceptionally talented, but he did not write by magic. He sketched his compositions, revised them, and sometimes got stuck. He would set work aside and return to it later. He considered theory and craft while writing, and he thought a lot about rhythm, melody, and harmony. Even though his talent and a lifetime of practice made him fast and fluent, his work was exactly that. Work. Jesus recognizes that good relationships take hard work. When he talks about marriage, divorce, and singleness, they are an analogy for our relationship with God. Marriage can be one of the most wonderful things that ever happens to a person. Divorce can be one of the most tragic. But wherever you find yourself in relationships with others, it is up to you to make these relationships the best they can be. What God desires is for us to remain faithful with family, with spouses, and with God. And that takes hard work. It takes total commitment, total devotion to God's kingdom, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. It's a hard saying, but committing to Jesus Christ can lead to a total and complete transformation in our relationships and in our own lives. Amen? Amen. Again, very